I want to say good afternoon, but this may be shown at night, so I'll start this off by saying hello. And I'm delighted to be a part of this program today. It's quite an honor for me, and we have some very, very outstanding and distinguished guests. In particular, the center of our interview today will be Professor Randy Stone, and we're at the University of Chicago's Law School, and we're going to be talking about really bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community, but more particularly, recently over the past months, the mayor of the city of Chicago appointed a special task force to investigate the issue of police accountability. That task force issued a major report about the state of law enforcement, the state of the Chicago Police Department, the state of the relationships between the community, the police department, social service agencies, lawyers, public defenders, you name it. And like the report went nationwide. And without a lot of ado, I want to introduce one of the persons that was one of the authors of that report. And this is Professor Randy Stone. He runs or works at the Mandel Legal Clinic at the University of Chicago. But since I have known him now for almost 40 years, Randy, we go back to 1980.
That's right.
And I actually knew you when you were working in the public defender's office in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
And you have had a marvelous career over the years. You are one of the most respected, and people speak of you in awe. I have run into people across this country, from Harvard University to Washington, D.C. I've talked to lawyers, and I've talked to non-lawyers, and you have really, really distinguished yourself in the field of criminal justice. I'm going to ask you to share with the viewers something about your background. I know where you went to law school, but tell them.
I went to University of Wisconsin Law School. I graduated in 1975. After law school, I went to Washington, D.C. to work for the Neighborhood Legal Services Program. I was a Reggie. In D.C., we worked with poor people who were being evicted from their houses. As you may recall, back in the 70s, there was a big gentrification project going on in Washington, D.C. Every day I went to work, I would meet with a family whose belongings were on the street because they were being evicted. There was a very aggressive eviction policy. I worked there for about a year, then I moved back to the Midwest, and I worked with a group called the Criminal Defense Consortium of Cook County. We had 6 neighborhood offices around Cook County, one in Woodlawn, Harvey, Evanston, Lakeview, Austin, and we were 4 lawyers, an investigator, a social worker in each office. And the idea was to provide an alternative to the public defender's office, to create an option for people who needed lawyers to come to get them in their own communities,
Right.
as opposed to going to an institution. Then I started teaching a bit here at the university. I did employment discrimination and criminal defense. Then I went into private practice with my partner, Buddy Clark, and we had a firm, Stone and Clark. We did a lot of civil rights work and criminal defense work and a lot of death penalty work at the time. The death penalty was still active in Illinois. After that, I moved to D.C. in, I believe it was 83. And I worked with the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. for about 5 years. I left there as the deputy director, and I came back to Chicago to work with the Cook County Public Defender's Office. I was the first African American to run that office in 1988. And it's one of the largest public defender offices in the country, in need of a lot of reform, in need of a lot of attention, and I worked there for about 4 years, and then I came back to the University of Chicago as the head of their Mandel Legal Aid Clinic, and I established a project called the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Project, where we began to focus on children who were being transferred from juvenile to adult criminal court. Back then, as you may recall, in the late 90s, there was this movement to call young African American kids super predators. And the idea was that these young children, who were then like 6 to 10, were going to turn into super predators when they reached their mid-teenage and early 20 years. And as a result of that research, the laws were changed all across the country. Every 40 states made it easier to move kids out of juvenile court to adult criminal court. When I first started practicing law, the only time you'd find a juvenile in adult court, they were charged with murder. They were usually 16 or 17 years old. But during the 90s, they had kids as young as 15 in adult criminal court. In some cases, 13 or 14, they could transfer kids. And these kids were being transferred for a variety of offenses. And they were uniformly African American and Latino. There was a study done in Chicago during that period where out of 100 kids transferred from juvenile to adult criminal court, only one was Caucasian. That's right here in the city of Chicago. So we've been doing that for the last 25 years now. I've been working here at the university, training law students and social work students about the realities of the criminal justice system. So we do individual representation and we do a lot of policy work. And lately the work has been focused on juvenile life without parole.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but I'm going to introduce the next, I'm not going to say he's a guest, he's a co-host of this program. This is attorney Louis Pyle. Louis Pyle is the former head of the Cook County Bar Association, which is the black bar association for Cook County in Illinois. It's one of the largest bar associations in the country. Now, I happen to have known Louis for more than 25 years. He's worked at John Marshall's Law School in the housing clinic. He has done so much work. He's worked over at Rainbow Push and holding special clinics, you know, for people who wanted information from the community about what they could get done in the legal system. Louis, tell us a little bit more about your background, where you graduated, and what you're doing now.
Absolutely. But first of all, I want to say I'm the other Lou, and I'm just very pleased to be here on a couple levels. One, I've always wanted to do a program with Lou Myers. Randy Stone is one of my idols when I was in law school, and off camera we have Wanda Carter. Wanda Carter is her former husband, late Morgan Carter, basically taught me about TV, taught me how to conduct myself, reject, so forth and so on. And I just want to acknowledge Wanda. In terms of my background, graduated from Northern Illinois University, a Master's of Public Affairs, John Marshall Law School, and John Marshall Law School has been very good to me. I'm one of the type of individual, I had a little bit of trouble getting to law school, but John Marshall, gave me a chance, and I'll be ever grateful for that. Had the opportunity of a lifetime to work under Harold Washington's administration, as well as our fraternity brother, Eugene Sawyer, in the area of purchasing. We call it procurement now, but back then we called it purchasing, contract administration, also being able to work in the Department of Aviation. My last position under Eugene Sawyer, Mayor Sawyer, was director of concessions. Have had the opportunity to teach at John Marshall, who actually since 1994, the Fair Housing Clinic. I was with the Fair Housing Clinic for actually 21 years. Now I'm just teaching the Fair Housing course. As a matter of fact, I'm teaching the course now. Been able to do some real estate development, which is my passion, and just trying to do what I can to be relevant and to have something meaningful to say. And again, I'm very glad just to be here with these two individuals who I've looked up to for a long time. Lou is actually right. He has known me well for 25 years because Lou, I'm going to date myself. I'm a veteran now. I've been practicing for 27 years.
Right.
And I met you when I was in law school, so it's actually over 30.
Now, Lou, don't be telling my age right now. I think that was a good background. Let me also say I'm Louis Myers, and I'm now an assistant professor at Chicago State University. I taught for more than 23 or 24 years in the city colleges of Chicago. I'm a practitioner. And Randy, the only thing before I get into the substance of what we're going to talk about today, you didn't get a big part. Randy Stone and I met in 1980. because he was one of the lawyers on the Pontiac case, which involved the indictment of 18 black defendants from Pontiac prison, and they were charged with capital murder. I was not living in Chicago at this time, and I moved here to try that case, and you were one of the lawyers on that case. Buddy Clark also participated in that case. And that case became a national case.
Don't forget Chokwe.
Chokwe Lumumba. I won't ever forget it. In fact, Chokwe's son is now running, Randy, you happen to know, he's in town tonight.
Oh, really?
And he's running for the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. His father became the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. So I wanted, to mention that, and then I wanted to get into what we really want to talk about today. Randy, when I started as a professor over at Chicago State, I started a dialogue about bridging the gap between law enforcement and the African American community in particular. I had no idea. I think this was long before the Laquan McDonald case, but it was incumbent upon me to realize that there was a problem. And Chicago, I knew from a number of years, had a problem between the police department, the African American community, and the Hispanic community. And after the death of Laquan McDonald, I was at least pleased that the mayor of the city of Chicago had the vision to realize that there was a real problem in this city. And he formed a task force, a police accountability task force. And that task force, I'm gonna let you tell the people who was on it. Many of the people that I knew, but I was most comfortable when I learned that you were on it, because I know your history of integrity, and I know your concern for the rights of poor people, African American people, and I know for a fact that you played a very influential role in terms of helping that committee of accountability get off the ground. Why don't you start by telling us who was on the committee, and then I'm going to get into what was your mission and purpose.
Well, it was a very, I can remember, I'm sitting at my breakfast table. It was around Thanksgiving. And it was right after the video of the Laquan McDonald shooting had been released. And I got a call from Lori Lightfoot, one of the members of the committee, who happened to be a former student here at the University of Chicago. And so I knew her, in that context. And she called and told me the mayor was forming a task force and asked me if I would be on it. And my initial reaction was, I don't think so. Primarily because I wasn't sure about the integrity of the task force. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to be a puppet of the mayor. And so the more we talked, she told me who the other members were. One was Sergio Acosta. He is a partner at a major law firm here in the city, and he's a former U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney. There was, as I said, Lori Lightfoot, who was also a former assistant U.S. attorney and is now a partner at a major law firm. There was a former high-ranking police officer who was a member of the task force who had retired, and he was going to be a member of the task force. And myself. And I remarked to her, I said, this task force looks awfully law enforcement heavy. And I'm just not sure that we're going to be able to do the job. And I said, I need to think about it. And she says, well, you don't have much time. We got to make a decision because the mayor wants to hold a press conference. And I said, well, I'm going to think about it. And then a few minutes later, I got a call from the mayor. I don't know how he got my phone number.
I wonder how.
And basically told me that he wanted the task force to be independent, that he wasn't going to meddle in the affairs of the task force. He wanted us to do an honest report. And so I convinced myself that I was doing this for the city. And I was doing this for my community in the city, primarily the African American community. And so I agreed to be on it, but I told both Ms. Lightfoot and the mayor that we had a composition problem, that the task force was way too law enforcement heavy. And as a result of that, we added a couple members. We added Victor Dixon. Victor is the executive director of the Safer Foundation.
Okay.
We added a woman named Sybil Madison Boyd, who teaches at one of the local universities and is very involved in juvenile justice and juvenile related issues. And then we added a woman named Alexa James, who was involved in the mental health community. So by the time the task force actually began its work, it looked a lot different than it looked when it was first constituted.
You ended up with, I think, was it Joel Ferguson? I mean, who was the Inspector General?
Joe Ferguson, exactly. Joe Ferguson was one of the initial members. Thanks for mentioning me.
Yeah, because
And Joe's he's also a former assistant U.S. attorney.
I remember.
But he is now the Inspector General of the city of Chicago.
Tell the public and the people who will be viewing this, let them know what the purpose was. I mean, you talked to the mayor, Lori Lightfoot gave you a call and said, we need you to do this, and you expressed your concerns about the composition of it. Maybe it was a little bit imbalanced toward law enforcement, but what was it, and what was it, for the lack of a better way to put it, what was the mission and purpose? What was it the task force, the police accountability task force was supposed to do?
The underlying mission was to address what you pointed out in your introductory remarks, and that is the lack of trust between the African American community, the Latino community, and the police department. It was pretty clear at that time, after the release of the video, and I can tell you this, the mayor and other people in the city were concerned about all these young people who were out in the streets protesting what had happened to Laquan McDonald. And that's really the message that we all need to remember, and as you and both you know very well, is that a lot of times it's what the people in the streets are doing that pushes the people in power to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think to put it in some kind of historical chronology, the Laquan McDonald video was not released until sometime in 2016.
Exactly.
And what happened was Thanksgiving was approaching.
Well, it was released, I think, toward the end of 2015.
That's right, toward the end of 2015.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came out, there were demonstrations throughout the city of Chicago.
Exactly.
Black people, white people, Hispanic people, people from everywhere. It became a national news story.
Exactly.
And Chicago overnight was on front and center in the New York Times. And people began to talk about the 16 shots that were fired into the body of Laquan McDonald. And I think that when you just made a reference to the fact that once these demonstrations happened, and once the public showing some sense of outrage, began to demand some answers about what was going on, the mayor then realized that something had to be done. Is that?
That's very accurate. And, to his credit, he responded.
Right.
And he created the task force, and we were supposed to go down to City Hall a couple days later and have a major press conference, and he was going to announce the task force and introduce us all to the city. As it turned out, when we got down to City Hall, the mayor had changed his focus and instead announced that he was firing the then police chief, Jerry McCarthy, and replacing him and announcing a new surge. So that just shows you the dynamics and the pressure that was going on in the city.
For the lack of a better way,
at that time.
And the city was not just in turmoil, but it was in borderline chaos.
It was.
And it was in political chaos. And I think it was not, and I think what is critical here, because this is going to be seen all over the country, what we're doing today, what was critical here, it had become a national news story. Baltimore, Ferguson, Missouri, Chicago, Illinois, New York City, New York. People were talking about the gap between law enforcement and African American citizens all over the country. Just give us a little brief description of who was it that was interviewed once you got to work?
Once we got to work, well, we divided ourselves into 5 different groups, and I'm hoping I can remember the 5. But it's community relations, which is the group that I headed, early intervention, video release. That's 3, right?
Right.
And then there was a group that dealt with de-escalation, and accountability and transparency. Those were the 5 groups that we divided ourselves into. And I can talk to you a bit about all of them, but I was particularly working with the community relations group. And I created a committee of about 20 to 30 people who came, and we came together, we met long hours talking about issues related to community relations. A lot of people that you know agreed to work on that group. And we focused on this particular issue about the relationship between the community and the police and what we could do to create.
Why don't you share a little bit of that?
Okay.
We're going to come back because that's going to walk us into something else, but I think it would be extraordinarily appropriate now. You know, you're talking about community relationship, and you interviewed, I presume you interviewed citizens from the community.
We interviewed a lot of
Politicians,
citizens from the community.
people who lived in the neighborhoods.
Everyday working people, professional people, law enforcement people. We went to the police academy. We talked to people who were involved in training. We looked at people who were involved in restorative justice work. We kind of covered the waterfront. And then we had 4 major public hearings all around the city. One on the west side, one on the south side, one on the north side. And we allowed people to come in and talk. And so I can tell you some of the striking things that affected me then and that still affect me today. It's just the stories that everyday people told about their encounters with law enforcement. Now, as you said, I've been in the criminal justice area for 40 years. But some of what I heard surprised me, just in terms of the passion and the emotion. I'll give you a couple examples. Brother talked about he was in his car driving down Stony Island with his kids in the back seat. He's pulled over by the police. The police come get out of their car, come to his car. One police officer pulls out his weapon and just taps on the back window where his kids are sitting with his weapon, just tapping on the window. And the brother talked about how humiliated he felt, how concerned for his children he felt, but he realized there was nothing he could really do. And that the humiliation that he felt at just that encounter, was so pervasive in the room. Second guy, young Mexican guy, got off work from his fast food restaurant, walking down the street, just got paid, on his way home. Police pull him over. He's walking, no reason. They just stopped him, searched him, patted it down, pulled out his money, and told him, it's a lot of money for a Mexican to have, don't you think? And you could.
These were white officers.
White officers. This was a young guy, early 20s, and when he told the story, once again you could feel the humiliation that he felt. And what I learned from these forums was it's not always the shooting or the brutality, but it's the daily sort of disrespect.
Randy, I was going to ask you about that because there are so many issues to cover on this. But what was it, given your background and given your experience, what was it that you came out of these hearings with that made you maybe see a different world or have a different view on what needed to be done what should be done, what shouldn't have been done. Let's get to that, and then we're gonna move on to another area I really wanna cover.
Well, that's an excellent question, and I'm going to say this, put it this way. I felt, and many of the other members of the task force felt, that we had to deal with this question of race and how people in certain communities were treated differently based on race, and how people in the larger community, I often talk about Chicago as being, separate cities in a lot of ways, because there are people who don't understand that the police treat you differently based on where they're patrolling. That the police on 63rd Street or 49th Street or 35th Street don't act the same way that they act on Broadway and diversity. And that there's not this, one elderly black woman testified. She said, people talk about officer friendly. I'm 70 years old. I've never seen Officer Friendly.
Never met him.
I want to meet Officer Friendly, because that's not how the police treat me and the people that I know in my community. So that was probably the biggest sort of takeaway for me.
We're gonna talk about that, and we're gonna take a short break. And when we come back, Attorney Powell, I want you to feel free. I think we got the background out of the way, and I have a whole host of other questions that I want to ask. And I can tell you, the viewing audience nationwide and around the country, I'm sure that they have things that they like to hear about that happen, because this really set a precedent for other places in the country. What you did on that Police Accountability Task Force became a module or a model for other cities to use in trying to address the problem between bridging the gap between the African American community and law enforcement, not just in Chicago, but throughout America, Baltimore, Ferguson, you name it. So we'll be back in a moment, and man, I'm so happy to talk with you about it, and I'm anxious to get back. Attorney Powell, you had some things that you wanted to ask Professor Stone.
Absolutely, and thank you. Randy and Lou, part of my background is fair housing, and fair housing to me is a subset of the civil rights movement. And I was taught, from my father and, from my elders in the community, is that a lot of times you have to tell the man what you want. You have to force the man in authority to a position that you need to be in. Vis-a-vis Dr. King in terms of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, you both know, was a very complex man, a man from the South, a man that after President Kennedy was murdered, became the president, and quite frankly, he did a lot towards civil rights. I don't think he got a lot of credit for it, but part of that was because Dr. King forced him to. He put him in a position where he's talking about fighting communism in Vietnam, yet black people are getting beat like nothing in Selma, South, so forth and so on. Professor Stone touched upon an area, briefly I wanted to come back to if we could, in terms of the embarrassment. Lou, you mentioned it as well. This was a national embarrassment, to the city of Chicago. Actually, quite frankly, embarrassment to Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel is a national figure because of his role as a former congressman, the chief of staff for President Obama. This was an embarrassment because it happened on his watch. When that young man, Mr. McDowell, got shot 16 times, in the aftermath, you had young people demonstrating in the street. You had people laying in the street. To me, that was like a tipping point in terms of forcing the mayor to do something. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, you're absolutely correct. One of the things when I talk to students about students always want to know, well, how can we affect change? What can we do to make things better? And there has to be a diverse approach. People have to understand what what they can do, stay in their lane and do it. So, but the idea, you're not gonna move things unless there are people willing to make a commitment, willing to get out in the streets. And a lot of what's happening today is driven by these young people, you know, in the various groups, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, that are out here demanding change. You know, there's a role for lawyers and law students, and, you know, we work with the courts and we can focus on reform as well. But unless the public, and that's across the board, black, white, Latino, are out there pushing the people in power to make the changes, it's not gonna happen. And I think we owe a debt to these young people who are out here demanding change.
I think that you're absolutely right. I always tell people, you know, we're getting a little bit older, Randy, but I am always inspired. One of the you know, the positive things about teaching is that it keeps us connected with the next generation, and it keeps us moving because their ideas are so important, and they really become the troops that have to implement many of the policy decisions that we're talking about. Let me go to another area, and this is a kickoff from what you mentioned about the race situation. We know, I think it was in 2014, that the Chicago Police Department stopped more than 250,000, basically African Americans, over an 8 or 9 month period of time. Now, for the public, let me say that again. The Chicago Police Department stopped 250,000 African Americans and Hispanics over a 9 month period of time. Most of those stops did not result in the recovery of any incriminating information. Most of those stops, and let me use the legal term, didn't have probable cause, didn't have what we in the law talk about, the Fourth Amendment, reasonable suspicion. They were stopped primarily, if the implication is right, because that they were African American, which was race-based. I know that your report, the Police Accountability Report, had a section that discussed the history of racism of the police department and those stops. I want you to say something about that, because many people in the public don't know that you, not the Department of Justice, but you all made the initial finding that there was a history of racism in the department, and it worked against the integrity of the relationship between African Americans and the city and the police department.
You know, that topic, the topic of race and racial discrimination and racism, is a very sensitive one. And we had a lot of fairly contentious discussions in the task force itself and among members of our community relations group about that issue. And we came to a consensus. Now, you know, as I said, there were, 7 or 8 members of this task force, and I left 2 people out that I need to mention. Maurice Clausen, who works for the MacArthur Foundation, was also on the task force. And Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, was also an advisor to the task force, and they both contributed to the report and to the work of the task force. We came to a consensus that it was important when we talked about racism to not appear that we were only talking about Laquan McDonald or Rekia Boyd. We wanted to go back and show this pattern and practice in history. So we went back to Fred Hampton, where the Chicago Police Department was involved
1969.
in that assassination in 1969. We could have gone further, but that's where we started. We talked about the hearings that Congressman Ralph Metcalfe had on the police department in the 70s. where he had hearings all around the city and focused on the way the police were treating those in the African American community, professionals, middle-class people, and working-class people. We talked about the John Burge era, where police department supervisors were torturing hundreds of African American men on the south side and the west side of Chicago, literally torturing people to get confessions, in some cases torturing innocent people to get confessions. And so we wanted to go back and to bring it all up to today to show that this is not something new and that we need to make sure we connect the dots. And one of the arguments that I always make is, there's always going to be another case. Laquan McDonald was the case for the end of 2015. Next year there'll be another case. But it's important to connect the dots and to make sure it's not about one case, it's about a history. And in order to change that dynamic, you got to know your history.
That's right.
Both African Americans as well as the larger city.
Right.
So they don't just think we're talking about some, one particular incident. We're talking about a history of incidents, and that's why you have to change the whole culture of the system. People talk about, well, there's just a few bad apples in the police department. Well, I reject that idea. We're talking about changing a whole system and culture that allows bad apples to operate and function over a 30, 40, 50-year period. And so it's not about 2 or 3 bad apples. It's about a whole system and culture that is rotten and that needs to be.
What did you find about that stopping of $250,000? Was that based on race? I mean, what was it that the members of the Accountability Task Force, what was the consensus that was about, and what did you decide that should be done about that?
There's 3 points on that. One, as you know, New York had the same issue, right?
Absolutely. Long before us. But,
long before us. Or
it was going on. Yeah.
And many other urban areas as well.
That's right.
Secondly, as you know, Chicago, 10, 15 years ago had a gang loitering ordinance.
That's right.
That was found unconstitutional, where the police were doing essentially the same thing, rounding up people, stopping them, searching them, frisking them with no probable cause. Thirdly, I think what our report found about the recent statistics that you pointed to, a lot of the police were saying, well, we got to stop these people because people in the black community commit more crimes, so therefore we need to stop more people in the black community. One of the things we noted in our report was it wasn't just the black community. If you looked on the north side in certain neighborhoods, black people were being stopped in those communities as well at a rate that far exceeded the stopping of white people. So it's across the board, it's across the city, and the task force, to its credit, laid it out in the report. We showed you where black people were being stopped in white neighborhoods at rates that were far disproportionate to their numbers, to counter this view that, we just stop them in the black neighborhoods because they're committing crime. It's citywide. And, that's another cultural thing that has to be changed. And as a result of the report and the Department of Justice report as well, and more publicity about these issues, I think we have the possibility of creating meaningful change. But once again, it's going to take a lot of pressure.
Well, let me ask you, what were some of the other, time is moving on us, but it's so much. I mean, man, we need about a 10-part series on this. What are some of the other recommendations at the conclusion of the investigation by the Police Accountability Task Force? What were some of the things that the task force decided? The public, believe it or not, Professor Stone, does not know. I mean, I find every day, and including a lot of my students, don't know what the recommendations and findings were And to me, many of them are so important that it's a disservice not to continue to highlight them because people need to know about them. What are some of the areas and some of the recommendations that you all made?
Well, we made over 100 recommendations,
Wow.
and we tried to be as comprehensive as possible. All of the recommendations and the report are on the web, chicagopatf.org. You can download the whole report. You can download the recommendations. You can download the executive summary. There are videos of the town hall meetings that we held around the city. You can go on the website and actually look at the town hall meetings that we held on the north side, the west side, the south side. So some of the recommendations, and as I said, there are over 100. Let me say one of the first recommendations we made that has been ignored, pretty much. And that is that the city and the police department need to acknowledge the history of racism as it relates to law enforcement and the African American community. That's one of the first recommendations we made. You never hear about it. Nobody ever talks about it. And it was difficult to get it in the report because it's obviously controversial. But the consensus at the end was that ultimately you can't make change unless you acknowledge the problem and the history of the problem. Somebody has got to step up and say, here are the facts. The Chicago Police Department has historically discriminated against its people of color in this city. But here's what we're going to do about it. We're going to acknowledge that it occurred in the past, and we're going to put together a plan to solve it so it doesn't go into the future. You can't change the present without acknowledging.
Why do you
the
think
history.
that nobody's acted upon that? I'm just curious.
Well, because it's hard. It's hard.
It's harder for people to accept the
It-
reality of it. It's
Exactly.
harder.
It's harder
to
to
say,
accept the
hey.
reality. It's hard to acknowledge it. A lot of folks in the city probably know the history,
Absolutely.
but until somebody gets the nerve and the gumption to stand up and publicly acknowledge it and say, you know this, as you've been in this area for a long time. And Lou, you know as well when you deal with fair housing. If people are unwilling to acknowledge the source of the problem, you're not gonna make much change. You're gonna make some change around the edges, but you're never gonna deal with the source. And so people are reluctant to even talk about race.
Yeah.
Let
What are
alone admit
That's right.
that there's a
That's
history of
that's a
racism.
historical problem, but what are some of the other recommendations? Just a brief, some that you think that ought to be highlighted for the public.
Okay, well, one, we dealt with the video release issue, right? We agreed
That
that.
involved,
the
the
policy-
problem with Laquan McDonald and
Right.
a year going by, it was
Exactly.
never released, and
So
the
we-
community felt violated by that.
Exactly. So we set a default, period of time that the city must release all videos related to shootings, police shootings, within a very discrete period of time, unless there's some abnormal reason not to. Now, I think it was a very small piece of the report, but a very important one, because what created the problem with Laquan McDonald, it's not so, in addition to what happened, was the fact that they suppressed the information for so
That's
long.
right. That's
And
right.
that created
That's
more and more frustration.
Right.
We looked at de-escalation. So we.
Tell us what that means.
What
A lot
what
of
that
people get.
means is, when the police approach a situation, they have a lot of options as to how they want to handle it. What we're saying is your first option should be to assess the situation and figure out, how can I use the least amount of force as possible? How can I rectify this situation with the least amount of force and violence? It sounds common sense, but what we want the police to begin to look at is that not only do they have a warrior function, but they have a guardian function. And we want them to start thinking about our community as a community that they need to protect and to guard and to serve, not one that they are looking at as one that they're going to attack and to confront.
Let me
So
ask
we
you
want
this.
them to change their mindset. So there are a number of recommendations in there that focus on de-escalation.
Was there any discussion among you about excessive force?
Great question. When we first started the task force, there was a lot of discussion, but we got the word from the Department of Justice that they were going to come in and do their report. And we were told that the Department of Justice wanted the issue of force and excessive force to be their bailiwick. So we did not spend, and as you read the Department of Justice report, a lot of their report is focused on the appropriate use of force, the unconstitutional use of excessive force, violence, etc. in their report. So they ask us not to focus on that issue, and we agreed, and that's the issue that a lot of their report is concerned with.
What was it, because we're getting toward the end, what was it, was a consensus, and you sit there and you heard the community meetings, and you had the benefit of sitting in the room with members of the Accountability Task Force. I think that you previously used the term contentiousness. Even within the room, there were people who were torn about which way we should go, which way is up, which way is down. At the end of the day, what were your feelings, if any, about how could the gap be bridged in the city of Chicago, in particular, between the Chicago Police Department, the people that you heard as a community relations person? Can we bridge the gap? And if so, how or why, or is that not realizable?
No, I think it absolutely is realizable. It is absolutely doable. We can create a community that trusts the police if we can create a police force that respects the community. And I think we can do it. And we've laid out some recommendations in the report. One of the things we talk about is this community policing. What is it? How do you define it? And what comes through in our report is that community policing has to be a philosophy, not a program in the police department, but a philosophy that is embedded into all the police in the city, from the academy to the veterans, so that the police officers and the police function is looked at as serving the citizens, is looked at as helping and guarding and protecting. One of the big issues right now I'm working on is this clearance rate. And by that I mean the responsibility of police to solve murders and violent crimes. Our police department is clearing murders at about less than 30%.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Which is less than half the rate in most major cities.
That's
So
right.
we've got people who have shot and killed other people
Walking around.
thinking that they will never be brought to justice.
And probably out shooting other people.
It could be.
Lou, we're running on a time schedule. Do you have any closeout questions you want to ask Professor Stone?
Rand, I just want to try to sum it up if I can, Lou. I think what you're doing is I tell myself, is next level. Because as you said earlier, you're trying to bridge the gap. You said something that's very key, very key. You said it is possible if people are serious, I'm talking about the powers that be, that we can have a police department that respects the community. Because you said something that was very profound to me. Not attacking the community, but holding the community in respect, i.e., my job is to serve and protect, not to harass you for any unnecessary reasons. Can you elaborate, just tie it in on that last point?
Well, I mean, it's throughout the report. There has to be, if you want to improve the clearance rate, if you want to solve more murders and serious crime, you have to have the trust and respect of the community. Because people are not going to talk to you and help you do your job if you're disrespecting them. So it's all tied together. Effective policing can occur unless there is a relationship between the community that the police are in and the police.
What's the first step, and now I'm being a professor, what's the first step in starting that process? We admit that there's tension, almost irreconcilable tension, because people are not talking. So if people want to talk, if the police wants to talk, and if members of the community want to talk, what is the visual process to start that?
Great question. One of our major recommendations that's also pretty much ignored is that the police department create a diversity officer of high rank in the department. And that diversity officer would be charged with creating this environment that you just talked about. By making sure, number one, that the training police officers receives reflects this philosophy, that they receive training in cultural competency. So when they go into communities that are different than they are, they get some training on how to deal with people. You know, one of the things we noted, you know, a lot of police officers, when they're hired, they're rookies, and they're sent to some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city because the senior officers have seniority. So they can select out and go to the communities where, you know, they're not as needed and it's not as dangerous. So you need to look at that. You need to look at training. We thought that training, and the Department of Justice report backs us up on this. The training that police officers receives has to be brought into the 21st century. They're still showing videos that are 10 and 15 years old at the training academy. So there's a lot of different areas that can be.
This has been so exciting. We're gonna have to do a part 3, 4, 5, and 6 on this because we didn't even get around to the DOJ, Department of Justice report, how that came about. Looks like now it may be at the bottom of the barrel, i.e. Attorney General Jeff Sessions appearing to indicate that it's not gonna be a priority in the new administration. Let me close out. You have any closing words you want to say? Because this is going out. No, Professor Stone?
Well, you know, I'm doing a talk next Thursday with the Illinois Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And I think the title of it's a discussion, I'm not doing a speech, it's a discussion, is Defending in the Age of Trump, which is right on your point. You know, now that we're moving into this new era, what should criminal defense lawyers begin to think about and do differently, if anything? But we're moving into a new era. We've got an attorney general who is not sympathetic at all to police reform, who claims he's wants to support law enforcement to the extent of ignoring community needs. So this is a very difficult transitional time that we all need to think about how we want to adjust going forward.
Well, I think that this has been a very delightful, helpful discussion. And I'm certainly, I hope that not just ordinary citizens, but everybody who is listening to this, I'm sure they're taking away some very important points. Let me thank you. I want to thank you for serving on the task force of accountability. And of course, I want to compliment you for your years of service. You have been dedicated. I can testify to that, to the African American community. You've been concerned about our rights and the rights of poor people in general. And the next time we talk, we're going to have to go to Miller versus Alabama. And because I also teach juvenile justice and talk a little bit about what's going on. But again, let me thank you so very much, and I'm looking forward to continue this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a great opportunity.